For 43 days, the workshop behind George's house had been silent. Every morning he walked past it, carrying a briefcase instead of the tools he once loved. Inside, dust settled over dreams he had postponed for years. He kept promising himself he would return tonight, but night always arrived with excuses. One Saturday, a simple wooden bench next door forced him to confront everything he had been avoiding. George was 32 years old, living a life that looked stable from the outside. He had a steady office job, a small, quiet house, and a routine that rarely changed. There was nothing obviously wrong with his life, yet a quiet dissatisfaction followed him everywhere. Each morning, on his way to work, he passed the small workshop behind his house, where the tools he had not touched in 43 days rested exactly where he had left them. His father's old saw lay on the workbench, while dusty tools and an unfinished bookshelf against the wall filled him with a small weight in his chest. George's father had been a patient carpenter, and as a child, George watched him build their home piece by piece after long work days. When George asked why he worked so slowly, his father said, "Because he does not forgive mistakes." That sentence returned to George whenever he avoided the workshop, telling himself he was too busy or tired and that free weekends would come, but they never did. One Saturday morning, George noticed his neighbor William, a retired man around 60, working carefully on a wooden bench. After about 20 minutes, William stopped, cleaned his tools, covered the bench, and went inside, repeating the same routine the next morning. Curious, George walked over, and William explained that he only worked 20 minutes because that was all he could give, but it gave him something meaningful to return to. That evening, George opened the workshop, breathed in the familiar smell of wood and oil, and began smoothing a small corner of the unfinished bookshelf for a few minutes. The next evenings, he returned for a few minutes at a time, simply showing up without big plans, even when he was tired or briefly skipped a night. After 2 weeks, half the bookshelf was smooth, and George felt quiet satisfaction before work demands drained his energy again. His boss assigned urgent projects with tight deadlines, and long hours led George to pass the workshop night after night, promising to return later. When George saw William still working and asked about the interruptions, William said the only real problem was never coming back. Those words stayed with George, and that night, he returned to the workshop without counting missed days and worked for a few minutes. Slowly, the bookshelf took shape as George sanded, measured, adjusted details, and sometimes simply stood thinking. One autumn evening, George placed the final shelf, completing an imperfect but finished bookshelf in his living room. He set his father's old carpentry book on top and felt calm, seeing proof that he had learned to return again and again. That night, he sketched a simple table in a notebook, planning only to begin without rushing. The next evening, he stepped into the workshop, worked for 5 minutes, cleaned his tools, and felt certain about continuing. He understood that progress did not require dramatic bursts of energy, but consistency and patience. Outside, the world stayed busy and unpredictable, with work and fatigue constantly competing for his attention. But he knew he would always return, and that made all the difference. The next morning, George woke earlier than usual and quietly stepped into the workshop, letting the soft light remind him why he had started. He ran his fingers across the wood and began measuring for the table, moving slowly and carefully, just as his father once had. In his movements, he saw echoes of his father's patience, and for the first time in years, he felt connected to those quiet lessons. Even on exhausting evenings after work, he paused at the door and chose to enter, refusing to let fatigue decide for him. Day by day, through short and steady sessions, the scattered pieces slowly began to resemble a real table.